They don't go to work. They don't go to work. They don't get food. They don't go to work. They don't get food. They don't go to work. They don't go to work. They don't go to work. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to our show this morning. And thank you for joining us here on, sorry, I have a bit of a problem here. My screen is going, playing around. Oh, well, okay. My guest today is Sarah, I think I pronounced it right, Nakacwa, and she's a Ugandan journalist and currently working with a really extraordinary organization called GRAIN, whom I'm sure many of you have heard of. Her passion is researching, documenting, and making the case for smallholder farmers on the African continent. And she's used her journalism training to make a case for what she calls sustainable agriculture, smallholder farming, as well as gender advocacy. So a warm welcome to you, Susan. Thank you for joining us on the show. And I did pronounce your name right, did I?
Yes, you did. You did pronounce my name right. My name is Susan Nakacwa, and thank you so much for having me today. Okay,
we're having a little problem hearing you clearly. Maybe you can hold the microphone up to your.
Sorry, there's a bit of construction going on right outside our office, so there's some noise. Please bear with me.
Okay, no, that's you're sounding great now.
Okay.
So you put together a report on the recent African Union free trade agreements with the US and other Europe and others. Whenever people talk about free trade agreements, one gets the impression of sort of macroeconomic policy, some intergovernmental negotiations. Well, what does it mean for ordinary people? What does it mean in particular for women?
The free trade agreement that we are talking about is sort of not like any other. So the report that we have just released as GRAIN is talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is a trade area that is specifically for the African continent. It is an initiative of the African Union, and it's a mega trade deal. It's a mega free trade deal that aims to consolidate African markets. It aims to boost trade between African countries and ultimately encourage and reinforce regional integration. That's what is being proposed, and its proponents are telling us that this is going to be able to transform the African continent into a continental and into an economic powerhouse. But we have seen so many other free trade agreements that have happened between Africa and the rest of the world. So when we talk about AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, and we talk about the Economic Partnership Agreements, all these are free trade agreements. They are neoliberal policies and frameworks that are used to liberalize economies, especially on the African continent. So we have a few of those that have been happening. Like I've mentioned, there was AGOA, there was the EPA, and now the EPA is coming to an end, and we have what we call the post-Cotonou agreement, which is post the EPA agreement. And all of these are talking about trade liberalization. They're talking about opening borders on the African continent so that there's more trade, apparently more trade between the different countries, different continents and different countries. What we are seeing on the ground is something totally different. This is a neoliberal agenda. Which is just breaking markets, and it's breaking African trade and just really destroying African development. So with the African Continental Free Trade Area, it is between the 54 African countries. And it is the African Continental Free Trade Area is, it's the 54 African countries signed on the agreement that was establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area. And then 30 countries ratified and dropped their instruments off at the AU Commission, which then made the African Free Trade Area sort of operational in July 2019. And then after that, a secretariat was formed, and the Secretary General sits in Accra. The main intention is to trade in goods and services, to encourage free movement of business and persons. But we have to remember that even though the African Continental Free Trade Area is starting, we still have other free trade area agreements that we have signed at the African level with regards to the EPA. So the Economic Partnership Agreement has been signed and was being negotiated between the East African community, between the Southern African community, and within the West African community. So as this process is going on and is about to be, and it's stalled a bit, then we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, we have post-Brexit negotiations, as well as AGOA negotiations that are happening. So it's sort of like...
Can you just hang on a minute? Can you just hang on a moment, because you're telling us a lot of things, and I think we need to get some clarification here.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone talks about nationalism and integration across the continent is a good thing. So are you saying it is not a good thing?
What we are saying about free trade agreements and free trade areas is that they liberalize spaces for trade. So in the case of the African continent, what we are saying is that these processes are never transparent. We have too many problems with regards to who is negotiating with who is sharing information with who, and who is giving us what kind of information and what kind of access to different markets. So in essence, free trade agreements have not been successful. They have not put anything on the table with regards to developing the African countries and the African continent in general, because they do not, they encourage dumping because of the difficulty. The kind of agreements that they sign, which allow for goods to come in, they kill industries, because as they dump, we cannot produce as a continent. There are issues around liberalization of the African continent, which also works against development at the continental level. And when it...
But you say nobody benefits, but why are African governments introducing this? Why are they signing? Why are they ratifying?
There's so many reasons around the ratification from the African countries. Number one is that some people are not transparent, so they are just doing it because they are greedy and because they don't understand the complexity of what's going on. Secondly, other countries have something to benefit. The story around free trade agreements doesn't start yesterday. It starts from the moment that we all signed on to the WTO. And every other free trade agreement that has happened after that is an offshoot of the WTO negotiations. The discussions around intellectual property, everybody wants markets. Everybody wants to sell their products, especially for industrialized nations. They have to sell their products and they have to control the market. If Africa starts producing, chances are that then they don't buy from the rest of the world. So you need to control that market. You need to liberalize, you need to deregulate, you need to be able to have a market for your own goods in the rest of the world. And that is why free trade agreements continue to happen. That's why our governments are signing on to them. But also because we have a population we have a generation of leaders who, I would argue, do not really have the best interests of their citizens at heart. Because all these processes are usually rushed and they never help any citizens of the countries.
Are they making a fortune out of this? Are the elites of Africa making a fortune out of this?
Most definitely. Some elites are making a fortune out of this. Because what we are seeing is that if you look at the different free trade agreements, they always talk about things like intellectual property rights, and those are negotiated, and they speak about, especially if you look at the agricultural sector, they start having a conversation around the harmonization of intellectual property rights. That speaks to the harmonization of seed policies. It speaks to the harmonization of standardization of seeds, and that automatically builds up the people who own the seed sector. And for a moment now, we know there's 4 major companies that own the seed sector.
Are these
intellectual property rights help this?
National corporations?
Sorry?
Are they? You said there are 4 companies that own the seed. Are these transnational corporations? Are they African organizations? Who are these?
They are transnational corporations. One of them is Syngenta. There's Monsanto. I think it's Dow. Yeah, so those are not African corporations, and they're generally not helping the ordinary African farmer. To paint a picture for you with regards to the agricultural sector, Africa's agriculture sector is mainly smallholder farmers. It's not industrial in any way. It's just starting to be industrial now, and that's what we are fighting against. The plight of smallholder farmers is very much at risk because the industrial agricultural sector, they own the seed, then they push for the use of chemicals, and that also has an effect on the environment. And then they also start owning the market, the entire, so to speak, value chain, the agricultural value chain, which becomes very problematic. So the agriculture sector on the African continent is mainly smallholders, and most of these smallholders are mainly women. So if anybody takes over the seed sector, then they are taking over a business or an area that women have mostly worked on. So if you look at the architecture of seed on the African continent, it is the women who select, it is the women who save, it is the women who ensure that there is seed for the next season.
But it's also women who have the traditional knowledge about seeds, which are appropriated, I understand, by the international corporations.
But you see, when you remove the women from that position, then you commercialize the seed sector. And once you commercialize the seed sector, the women have no say on the seed anymore. That's something that they understand. You take that away from them, you're moving them from an important sector, but you're also affecting the nutritional decisions that they make in the home. You're also affecting the way they run their homes in healthcare. They are the caregivers. And anything to do with nutrition, anything to do with food, those decisions are made by women.
Right.
So the corporatization of seed means that women cannot be in these processes. And so increasingly we are seeing that.
Help us understand how the free trade agreement that the African Union has proposed, how has that enabled these transnational corporations to dominate or try to dominate the market?
Okay, so within these free trade agreements, when we speak about the African Continental Free Trade Area in particular, it is going to be opening borders across the continent. So Africa is essentially going to become one market. And
opening the borders to whom?
To the rest of the world to come and trade. So the idea is that the borders will be opened for the African countries to trade within each other. But we do have difficulties around rules of origin because we do not really have the mechanisms in place to determine the, so to speak, quote unquote, ID of a product. Where is it coming from? So if a product lands into, say, Uganda, you can move it because the rules of origin will then mention the product as being from Uganda. You can market it across the continent. So the nitty-gritties of that is that you're opening borders of the African continent to the rest of the world. And as you open those borders, you allow for goods to come from elsewhere in the world. That encourages things like dumping. It encourages things like killing industries because now there are cheaper products coming from the rest of the world into the continent. There's a substitute for a locally produced good. And industries on the continent keep dying. The agricultural sector keeps dying. But then there's access for the international products to come in into the continent and then move freely across the continent.
Give us some examples of the kind of things that are being dumped in Africa.
Okay, so there's quite many. There's the milk debate that's ongoing at the moment. We have so much powdered milk on the continent at the expense of fresh milk, which is mainly produced by smallholder women pastoralists and women producers. So as we go on, we are seeing that Danone, we are seeing Nido, we are seeing all these products coming onto the continent, and we are seeing the African milk products, the fresh milk coming up, being dismantled. It is now more expensive to buy fresh milk than it is to buy powdered milk, processed milk products.
And Europe and US.
Yes, and those come from, we are seeing, I think one of the biggest now controllers of the milk sector on the African continent is Danone. And if they have the control of the African dairy sector, that means that we are seeing a lot of these products coming onto the continent. Then the smallholders who have one or two cattle that they have, which supply milk to the neighboring areas or to their neighbors, cannot do that anymore, because number one, once you control that market, then that the lady who produces milk for the community is encouraged to send her milk to a dairy corporation. Right. And then they create a value chain which then takes the milk out of the communities, and it comes back as a processed product. We are seeing a lot of difficulty in West Africa at the moment in the consumption of fresh milk, because it's hardly there. What you're seeing is processed milk coming from the rest of the world.
Well, that's been a sort of the continuity of French colonialism, which, I mean, in Senegal, you can't go to Dakar, you can't get fresh milk anywhere. It's just powdered milk, and it's just everything comes from France in the shops there. So, but you're talking about agricultural products being dumped and having a direct impact on the ability of women who are the main producers, main smallholder producers in Africa. It is now going to undermine their ability to survive. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it is. It continuously does. And I think we have to look at the history around women on the African continent and what they can and cannot do. I do not want to call women vulnerable, but there have been very many people that have spoken about women as being vulnerable. Women need to be given enough space to be able to express themselves, but also to make decisions that affect them and what they do. At the moment, what we are seeing with the African Continental Free Trade Area and almost all free trade area agreements that are signed, women are never consulted. And because the work that they do is considered as informal and it happens in the private, that means that their say and their contribution in that sector is never listened to. As a result, we are seeing that women cannot, the issues that affect them cannot be discussed at that level. And this has informed a lot of what we spoke about in the research that we wrote. So things to do with the privatization of water, which is a very basic necessity. The women are the ones who fetch this water. I mean, women and children fetch water in the rural communities across the continent. And when you privatize things like water, then it means that women have to suffer to go and get water. When you talk about the intellectual property rights around seeds, you're talking about women finding difficulty in accessing seed for the next planting season. If women are the ones who have been doing all the planting and the decisions around which seed to save for the next season, which is the best seed to eat and what is to be saved for the next planting season, and they do not have that opportunity anymore, it means that women are being taken out of that sector. We are talking about access to medicine as well as the next difficulty that is affecting women. Again, women are the caregivers. In countries like South Africa, we've had successes around women fighting for the introduction, the necessity for access to medicine, for medicines to be free, to be fair, because let's face it, a lot of women on the African continent Number one are the caregivers, but also a lot of the medicine on the African continent is not ours. It is it is imported from different parts of the world. So we need access to these medicines. And if they cannot be gotten, then women are the ones who are facing the brunt of looking after the sick in their communities if they are not well looked after. So cheap labor, again, the informal sector is mainly women. About 40% of the informal sector is women. And cross-border trade, what they tell us is that this will encourage cross-border trade. What we are saying is that the informal sector is not being spoken about. It is the largest sector on the continent. It's just not being addressed, and the problems that they are facing across the border. One of the things that we are finding across the border is that women are getting attacked, women are getting abused, women are not, their problems are not listened to at the border. It takes a bit longer to clear border processes. Once that happens, then women are in danger of being exploited and being abused. And we need to have a conversation about that. Exploitation of cheap labor, women are being exploited. We know this is a problem that happens against women all the time, but these need to be addressed as well. We have something along the lines of special economic zones, which is what the Continental Free Trade Area is really pushing. They're speaking about special economic zones. We have a lot of those on the African continent. And what we are saying is that this amplifies the problems that women experience. And this is across Asia. There's already been research around the dangers of the special economic zones. And what we are saying is that if the Continental Free Trade Area does not address things like this, it becomes problematic, because the Continental Free Trade Area is a framework that already exists from different free trade areas that have not worked. The model of the free trade area has not worked, and we need to revise it. We need to have a different conversation about free trade areas in general.
So in addition to being marginalized, being forced to impoverishment as a result of the dumping of goods as a result of the free trade agreement, we are today facing a situation where in many countries we have the pandemic, the COVID-19. And that is, in many countries, has been affecting women because they're the main ones who get the food to the market, but they are being denied from doing that. Is that happening in Uganda?
Sadly and unfortunately, it is happening, and it was happening in Uganda. I think Uganda had the biggest and I think the most ambitious lockdown across the continent. We had a night curfew starting at about 7 o'clock. And we also had a lockdown where a lot of the sectors were not working. The women that you see in that picture were sellers, they're vendors, fruit vendors. And what we know is that vendors are mainly women. And the reason that they're mainly women is because, number one, women are not easily employable because they do have to look after their children. Vending is a bit more flexible in terms of looking after your children and trying to also get your other businesses going as you look after your children, look after your home, and then also get some side business, some side income from the vending business. And these women were beaten at the beginning of COVID-19 because they were, quote unquote, according to the army, not meeting the presidential guidelines on COVID-19. The president had actually given permission to people who sell food items to stay working, but the army took the laws into its own hands and did that. Of course, they were cautioned, but I think this is something that has happened across the continent, the militarization of the COVID situation. This happened in Kenya, this happened in Uganda, it happened in South Africa, one of the biggest economies on the continent. And there were so many other reports that were reported around the army taking over the implementation of COVID regulations, which has turned out very humiliating for women. They've thrown away their food items and attacked the space. I think for these particular ones, it is attacking the space where women normally survive, where women normally make their little money. and where women know that this is the space that I can call my own. And that space was also attacked during COVID-19. Some women were sleeping in markets because of the lockdown. They were not allowed to go home under the assumption that they would spread the virus to their children if they went back home. So there are few cases of women who slept. Actually, there are many cases in Uganda, particularly, of women who slept in the markets. And then we talk about hygiene in the markets. We talk about their own safety, because the president eventually gave instructions for them to be given mosquito nets so they do not suffer from malaria. But at the end of the day, we have to look at women who are serving the nation, because these markets remained open for the ordinary person to go and shop their products. But they were living under humiliation. Some of them could not take baths. And let's not talk about the bathrooms and how they looked. Let's not talk about when you're asleep, who could attack you and how. All of this. So for us, the infringement on that space where women normally make their own money is a bit difficult to stomach. And COVID-19 has shown that these spaces are very important, but also they need to be protected. And they need to be respected so that women feel like they are part of the economy. And that beating that the women endured was very humiliating for a lot of us as women.
So, help us understand, I mean, women have not just been passive. What kind of organizing has been going on? There's a long history of women organizing, even under colonial times, and throughout the period of independence. So help me understand what kind of organizing is going there. I mean, they must know. They know day-to-day experiences of not being able to survive economically, being punished by the army, affected by COVID. So how are they organizing? How are they responding to this?
I think women's organizing is far and between. We also have to contextually understand the role of women on the African continent. There are so many things that are happening along the organizing of women. There's patriarchy, there's tribalism, there's lots of other things that we have to consider. But putting that aside, women work behind the scenes to ensure that these things happen. So one of the most the biggest examples I could give was within South Africa and the women's wing that was very political and tried to fight. The ANC Women's League that was very influential in fighting the apartheid regime. But increasingly, we are seeing women coming out and speaking for themselves. Women's groups are also coming up and speaking about the difficulty around cross-border trade. Organizations like EAC are coming up and speaking about these things and saying it's not right that women's trade is being affected, that women's spaces are being affected, and also groups that are coming up to help in just generally ensuring that women are okay. But the one thing that really we need to also appreciate and understand on the African continent is that discussions around women and trade have not been very, very vocal. And that's why we wanted to write this paper, because we wanted to see that it starts a conversation around women and trade, their introduction to the process, also their contribution to the processes, and how are they being picked up, and who is picking what? Because what we were seeing is that although a lot of this organizing was going on, women were not part of the conversation. So for women and trade in particular, this is our prayer, that there's so many other people that can rally behind us and we start organizing so that we start speaking the same language when it comes to issues like this. It is problematic. There's just a few bits and pieces of information and people coming up to speak about these dangers, but mostly the conversation around women and trade, the feminist critics that have critiqued its growth and development haven't been on the African continent. So this is for us a beginning of speaking about this. Even civil society criticizing the Continental Free Trade Area, again, women's issues didn't come up. So for us, we are starting a conversation with this paper. We are saying we need to start talking about all of this. It's difficult, but I think the conversation is starting.
Are there organizations of small farmers who are able to discuss the common problems that they face? What kind of organizations of farmers, smallholders exist in Uganda?
We have quite a few that are speaking about women issues. We have the Eastern and Southern African Farmers Forum, which is across Africa. It has chapters across the continent, Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, and with chapters in West Africa as well. We have the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, which has a women's wing as well, that speaks about the dangers that women are facing in agriculture and in doing business and in doing things like. We have the East African Small Scale Farmers Association. All of these are working towards speaking about women's issues, but they are speaking about women's issues in terms of what women are doing and what kind of dangers women are facing across borders, the non-tariff barriers that women are facing as they cross borders from one point to another, the abuse that they face. But they are not only speaking about the bad things. I think within the different organizations that we see, we are also celebrating women, especially the women smallholder farmers, who we say are the custodians of seed, they're the custodians of the agricultural sector, they feed the continent, they feed the children, they make nutritional decisions, and they ensure that the agricultural sector doesn't die out. So yes, they again, like I said, there's a danger that we're not speaking about women and trade, but we have a space and we have spaces where we are speaking about women and their contribution to the agricultural sector and their contribution to development. And it's just parts and bits and pieces, or it hasn't been highlighted as much as we would love it to. So we are starting all these conversations and we want them to continue.
So to what extent do you see a build-up of opposition to the African free trade agreements continentally?
The opposition to the agreement has always been there. I think what we are doing is resounding what everybody else is saying. The Continental Free Trade Area has not been transparent. It has not been inclusive. What we were told at the start was this agreement was a political process. And because it was a political process, it was being negotiated at a top level. Because of that, a lot of civil society organizations have come through and spoken about the lack of transparency in free trade agreements in general, but the African Continental Free Trade Area in particular. One of the things that we also look at within the African Continental Free Trade Area is also the conversation around who are the funders of the Continental Free Trade Area. At the beginning, it was, again, countries from the West that were funding the Continental Free Trade Area. The argument is that if this is something that is supposed to be developmental to the African continent, and is supposed to be to influence and speak to the growth goals and development goals of the African Union, then it should be funded by the African Union. It should reflect opinions from across the continent. It should be able to speak for the ordinary African. It should be able to allay our fears in terms of development, in terms of inclusivity, in terms of recognizing that Africans own this process. At the moment, we don't own that process at all. Recently, civil society organizations released a statement, and in that statement, they argued that they shouldn't accelerate the negotiations of the African Free Trade Area because of COVID-19. When COVID-19 came, there was an insistence that the negotiations should continue regardless of what was going on. And then they said that they would continue online. So they were fast tracking the negotiations from a phase 3 negotiation to phase 1, so that they can do now digital negotiations. And civil society organizations were arguing that this cannot be the case because barely 50% of the African population has internet access. So you cannot say that the Africans own the process when some negotiators might not be able to come online because they cannot afford data bundles. And what kind of negotiations are those when even the WTO was struggling to have negotiations online? What would it mean for an African continent? So the opposition has been there. It has been there because the process is rushed. It has been there because it is an additional liberalization agenda. It has been there because of the intellectual property negotiations that are intended to happen in phase 2 of the negotiations. So it's been there because we just see a repeat of all the other all the other FTAs that have failed. And yet, even the AfCFTA, or the African Continental Free Trade Area, is the exact document that we see in the other ones. There's no difference. The framework still exists, it's still the same.
So given how many states have ratified, is this now a fait accompli? Is it something that can be opposed? What are the possibilities? Where is the hope? Where is the possibilities for the future?
That's a very, very interesting question, because only 30 countries have ratified. We have 54 countries on the African continent. And I think only 30 countries ratifying speaks to a greater problem. Maybe we shouldn't be too excited about it. I am not excited about it because it has too many problems already. So I think we need to go back to the drawing board and set up an African agenda. Set up something that speaks to Africans, something that we can own as Africans. Our concerns have been around the pressures of an early deadline. Many stakeholders were not involved in the negotiations. The negotiation was haphazard, and it was exclusive to a few people, mainly government officials. Our feeling is that a non-inclusive process means that this continental free trade area is not attuned to Africa's transformation agenda. We will not cultivate it. We will not own the process. We don't own the process. We will not own it. It feels like something that is being dumped on us. And for me, I think we need to go back on the drawing board. We need to be able to understand what the Africans want, have a negotiation process that is African-oriented and African-driven. We have to be able to speak about problems that affect ordinary African people, because what we are speaking about within the free trade areas is a very exclusive group of Africans, and not everybody. So for us, the informal sector is a big part of the African continent. And if we're not speaking about it, I don't think we are speaking to Africans at all, or about Africans. So I think there will be light at the end of the tunnel if we have another discussion where we say, we will strip this agreement from its natural existence and start again.
But with the majority of countries ratifying, what are the strategies for persuading the others not to go down this route?
What's very interesting is that I don't think we have to. I don't think we have so much work to do with regards to stopping other countries from being a part of it, because even from the start, different African countries were cherry picking what to sign on and what not to sign on. It took a long time to get to 54. So the fact that from 2016 up to today, we only have 30 countries that have ratified, it's already problematic. The other countries have spoken about their sovereignty being affected. They've spoken about not wanting maybe a universal customs union, because that means that they lose their position and their position on the continent, or their traders. Or Nigeria was very vocal, although they eventually came on and dropped their instruments. They've been very vocal in terms of speaking for their smallholders, the artisanal communities that would be affected by all of this. So yes, there's no particular speech or strategy that has been laid out with regards to how to stop the other countries. But I think for a few of the countries, when they read into the different narratives that are being put out with regards to the continental free trade area, then some countries are refusing to sign by themselves. So I think we are working also on that, because if countries are refusing to sign, then that informs the research that we do and the kind of conversation that we have with regards to the African continental free trade area. For example, it was supposed to be become operational on 1st July, and the AU Secretariat has gone silent since then. We do not know now when it will be operational again. But I think what we need to understand is that countries are making their own decisions as countries, and we're just adding to what they would like to see and hear in this area.
So, what one final message that you would like to convey to people watching this program? What should we be paying attention to? What should we be doing?
Thank you for that question. It's one of those, everything just comes into your head at once. But I think I think our main takeaway from all of this is, personally, it's women. How are women being represented in something like the African Continental Free Trade Area? I am so concerned about that, and I would love everybody to rally behind us to have this conversation and also bring the plight of the informal sector. So for me, women, the informal sector, those are conversations we cannot get away from. But also, one thing that civil society organizations on the continent have recently been talking about is the transparency. I think if you've seen on bilaterals.org, we leaked the documents of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and so have all the continental free trade. All the free trade areas that have been released. There is no transparency in these negotiations. There is never anybody who is involved, who is the common person. So our lingering question is why we always have to leak these documents. If they are so good for the common good, why aren't these documents on the table for us to read? Why do we have to keep leaking them? Why do we have to keep stealing them from somewhere to be able to reach them? So the transparency is a concern for us. The intense liberalization agenda, the agribusiness agenda that is in these FTAs and just generally in all the bilateral and multilateral negotiations that happen. We need to understand, and we beg that we are understood as Africans, that we also have systems that work. We want to say, especially for the smallholder farmers, that what is called the informal sector, the informal seed sector, is a system, and it should be understood. So within that, we are saying there's knowledge on that continent, there's indigenous knowledge in agriculture, there are practices that work on the continent, and those need to be recognized. And it is not something that is just falling out of the blue. But I think the conversation is, let's switch the African continent, let's switch the agricultural sector because the informal sector is not doing well. But what we are saying is that the smallholder farmers do work. Women need to be listened to, women need to be understood, but also the free trade agreements need to be very context aware.
Well, thank you very much for helping us understand what is actually really important, so fundamentally important in terms of, in a sense, the recolonization of our continent and the people who are affected. So I'm really grateful to you for helping us understand what at non-level looks like something rather esoteric about continental free trade agreements, but to understand its impact on the ground, and in particular the impact on women, I think is very helpful. So thank you so much for joining us today, Susan.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been a real pleasure, and I hope you continue the extraordinary work that you and your colleagues in Grain are doing. So once again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the great work you're doing yourself.
Oh, thank you. Little contribution. Go well, and we will, I hope, be in touch again soon.
Definitely. Thank you so much, and have a lovely day.
And you. Thank you for joining us here on discussions of the impact of the continental free trade agreements in Africa on women. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press, signing off for today. And I look forward to having you on the show again in the coming period. I will just end with if I can find it. Oh well, I can't. So, but thank you for joining us today.